You've been told you need $1 million to retire. That's cute, because most Gen X people don't have $1 million. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Some of you are going to retire better than people with twice that, because the question isn't whether $500,000 is enough. The real question is, are you retiring like a boomer or like someone who survived 2008 and learned the rules are fake? My name is Frank, and I spend way too much time thinking about retirement math, broken promises, and why everyone is terrified of being old and broke. So today, we're answering one simple question. If you're Gen X and you've saved $500,000, are you safe, or are you one medical bill away from becoming a Walmart greeter with back pain? Let's talk, because the retirement industry has been lying to you, not with numbers, with fear. They want you to believe retirement is a finish line. Hit $1 million and you win. Anything less and you're doomed. But retirement doesn't work like a video game. It works like real life. Messy, unfair, and full of expensive surprises. The $1 million number became popular because it sounds clean. It's a headline number. It's easy to repeat, and it makes financial advisors look important. Because if they convince you you're not ready, you'll panic and pay someone to fix your life. But let's be honest, Gen X doesn't trust anyone. Gen X trusts two things: a car that still starts and a paycheck that clears. So when somebody tells you you need $1 million, Gen X doesn't hear advice. Gen X hears a threat. And honestly, you're not wrong, because most of the people giving you retirement advice are the same people who were shocked when the housing market collapsed. You remember that. Of course you do. You watched grown adults with college degrees get wiped out like they were disposable napkins. So yeah, Gen X is skeptical, Gen X is paranoid, Gen X is right. Now let's talk about the truth. $500,000 can absolutely be enough to retire, but not if you retire like a boomer. Boomers retire with this fantasy that life stays stable. They buy a golf cart, they buy a boat, they move to Florida. They buy a house that costs more than their original house, and then they act surprised when inflation shows up like an uninvited drunk uncle at Thanksgiving. Gen X doesn't retire like that. Gen X retires like a cockroach. I mean that as a compliment. Gen X survives. Gen X adapts. Gen X doesn't care about looking rich. Gen X cares about not getting crushed. That mindset matters more than the number. Because retirement is not about how much money you have. Retirement is about how much money you need. And those are two very different things. Let's make this painfully simple. If you have $500,000 saved and you're invested properly, you might average somewhere around 5 to 7% a year long term. Not every year. Some years the market will punch you in the face. But long term, that's a reasonable range. So let's say you average 6%. 6% of $500,000 is $30,000 per year. That's what your money might generate. Now here's the first uncomfortable truth. $30,000 a year is not retirement. That's a part-time job without the job. And if you're thinking, Frank, that sounds depressing, relax, because that's not the full picture. Because you're Gen X, which means you have two things boomers love to ignore. Number one, flexibility. Number two, Social Security. Boomers love to pretend Social Security doesn't exist. They talk about it like it's a mythical creature, like Bigfoot. Gen X knows better. Gen X assumes Social Security will exist, but it'll be slightly broken, like everything else. So the real retirement equation is not, can I live off investment returns forever? That's boomer thinking. The real question is, can I survive long enough for my money to do its job, and then let Social Security reduce the pressure later? Because if you retire at 55, you're asking your savings to cover a lot more years. If you retire at 62, you've got Social Security coming sooner. If you retire at 67, Social Security is right there waiting. And the difference between those ages? That's the difference between panic retirement and calm retirement. So if you're Gen X with $500,000, your retirement isn't doomed, but it is conditional. It depends on one thing: spending. Not your portfolio, not your return rate, spending. Because the retirement industry wants you obsessed with how much you have saved, but the real killer is how much you spend once you stop working. Let me show you why.
If you withdraw 4% per year, that's the famous 4% rule, which isn't a rule, it's an old research study from the 90s that people treat like a religion, but whatever. 4% of $500,000 is $20,000 per year. That's not even a decent used car payment in 2026. So most people hear that and go, "Oh my God, I'm screwed." And then they start crying into their 401k statement. But Gen X doesn't cry. Gen X just gets angry and builds a backup plan. Because Gen X already knows the 4% rule is too simplistic, because Gen X lived through a market crash. Gen X knows what sequence of returns risk is, even if you don't call it that. That's the fancy phrase for if the market crashes right after you retire, you're cooked. And Gen X knows that's possible. So here's the real math. If you have $500,000 and you want your money to last 30 years, you're probably looking at withdrawals somewhere between 3 and 5%, depending on your lifestyle and flexibility. 3% is conservative, 5% is aggressive, and Gen X is not aggressive. Gen X is cautious. So let's use 4% as a starting point. That's $20,000 a year. Now add Social Security. A typical Gen X worker might get something like $2,000 to $3,000 a month, depending on earnings history. Let's say you get $28,000 a year. Now, suddenly, your retirement income is not $20,000. It's closer to $48,000. That's a very different conversation. And if you're married, 2 Social Security checks changes the entire game. Now, you might be looking at $60,000 plus. And if you're thinking, "Frank, why doesn't anyone explain it this way?" Because fear sells, that's why. Now let's get even more realistic, because retirement is not about averages. Retirement is about your lifestyle. And Gen X has a weird advantage here. Gen X is the only generation that can be rich and act broke at the same time. You'll have $500,000 saved and still drive a Toyota that sounds like it's powered by duct tape and spite. You'll refuse to upgrade your phone, but spend $600 on concert tickets without blinking. So Gen X spending isn't random, it's strategic, and that's exactly what makes $500,000 work. Because most people don't run out of money in retirement because of inflation. They run out because they retire and immediately start spending like they're in a pharmaceutical commercial. They start traveling nonstop. They start buying luxury junk. They start paying for their kids. They start paying for their grandkids. They start buying stuff to prove they made it. Gen X doesn't do that. Gen X doesn't need to prove anything. Gen X just wants peace, and peace is cheap. The biggest factor in whether $500,000 is enough is not your investment return. It's whether you own your home. If you're Gen X and your mortgage is paid off or close to paid off, $500,000 is a completely different retirement than if you're still renting, because rent is not a bill. Rent is a life sentence. Rent is inflation's favorite toy. If you own your home, your biggest expense is controlled. That means your retirement plan becomes stable, and stability is basically the holy grail for Gen X, because you've spent your whole life watching stability disappear. Now let's talk about the biggest retirement trap, healthcare. Because retirement planning videos love to talk about stock returns, but nobody wants to talk about what really destroys retirees. A single medical event, a chronic illness, a spouse needing long-term care. That's the real monster. And Gen X already knows it. Gen X is the generation that doesn't trust the system, because the system always comes with fine print. So if you want to retire with $500,000, you need one thing more than anything else, a buffer. Not a yacht, not a new car, a buffer. Meaning, if your spending is $45,000 a year, you don't plan for $45,000. You plan for 50 or 55, because life will find a way to send you a bill. Life is basically a subscription service you never agreed to. Now here's where Gen X gets dangerous, because Gen X doesn't just save. Gen X builds escape tunnels, side hustles, rental properties, consulting gigs, part-time work. Not because Gen X loves entrepreneurship, because Gen X doesn't trust employers. And that is a massive retirement advantage, because if you retire with $500,000 and you can generate even $10,000 to $15,000 a year from part-time income, you reduce withdrawals. And reducing withdrawals early in retirement is everything. That's how you beat the market, not by timing it, by reducing pressure on your portfolio. That's how you survive a crash, because if the market drops 30% and you're forced to sell investments to pay bills, you lock in losses. But if you can cover expenses with a little income, you let your portfolio recover. That's not just smart, that's Gen X survival instinct. Now let's address the real question you're probably thinking. Okay, Frank, so how much can I actually spend? Let's make this brutally simple. If you're Gen X with $500,000 saved and you want a retirement that lasts, you need to live somewhere around $40,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on Social Security timing and whether you own your home.
If you're trying to spend $80,000 a year with $500,000 saved, you are gambling. And Gen X doesn't gamble. Gen X watched gambling destroy people. If you want to spend $80,000 a year, you either need a pension, a paid-off home, or you need to keep working. And yes, working longer is annoying, but it's also the single most powerful retirement hack in existence. Because working one extra year doesn't just give you one extra year of income, it also gives your money one extra year to grow, and it gives you one less year to withdraw. That's a double win. If you delay retirement by 2 years, you can completely change your entire outcome. Now, here's the truth nobody wants to say. Gen X doesn't actually need $1 million. Gen X needs control. Gen X needs predictable bills. Gen X needs flexibility. Gen X needs a plan that survives chaos. Because Gen X doesn't believe the system will behave. And Gen X is right. So, if you're sitting there with $500,000 saved, here's the real answer. Yes, you can retire, but only if you stop thinking like a boomer. Boomers retire like the economy is stable. Gen X retires like the economy is a drunk driver. And that mindset is the difference between comfort and disaster. Now, here are the 3 rules that make $500,000 actually work. Rule number 1. Housing is everything. If you own your home, you have a real chance. If you're renting, you need a stronger buffer. Rule number 2. Flexibility beats math. If you can reduce spending during bad market years, you survive. If you refuse to adjust spending, you break. Rule number 3. Gen X wins because Gen X doesn't chase status. Gen X doesn't care about impressing strangers. Gen X cares about survival and freedom. And that's why Gen X with $500,000 can retire comfortably, while someone else with $1 million can still be broke because they spend like idiots and you don't. Now, if you want the real punchline, here it is. The retirement industry wants you terrified because fear sells products. But Gen X doesn't buy products. Gen X buys backups. Gen X buys options. Gen X buys peace. So, if you're Gen X with $500,000 saved, you're not behind, you're not doomed, you're not stupid, you're just awake. And if you want the best retirement strategy, stop chasing a magic number. Start building a lifestyle that can survive a broken system. Stop buying traps. Start building kings. That is the logic. Subscribe for more.